And one of the things I learned about Neanderthal, which I thought was fascinating, and I didn't realize, that we have never found an intact Neanderthal skeleton, which is really interesting given that, we have found intact mammoths, for example. Do you have any hypothesis or
Yes,
educated guess on that, Elizabeth?
it's very hard to find an intact human skeleton in general because basically, we're we're not as robust as, let's say, a mammoth, right? So some of it is just robusticity. But I also think the other thing is that this does suggest that there wasn't always burial, that, we increase our odds of finding complete skeletons when there's intentional burial. And there's been a debate whether Neanderthals buried their dead or not. There is a famous flower cave burial site.
I am here to discuss the so-called flying saucers.
We know now that in the early years of the 20th century, this world was being watched closely by intelligences greater than man's.
Did the CIA write Wind of Change by the Scorpions?
As humans busied themselves about the various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied.
Dr. Loeb, what percentage chance do you give it that you have indeed uncovered extraterrestrial or non-human technology?
With infinite complacence, people went about their affairs, yet across an immense ethereal gulf, intellects vast and unsympathetic drew their plans against us.
All of a sudden, a stick out of nowhere landed right in front of us, and there was no tree, nothing overhead. Something threw it at us.
Yeah.
All things unexplained.
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.
Hello, all you unexplained ones. Thank you so much for joining us for yet another exciting show. We are grateful to each and every one of you for tuning in. If you haven't yet, please do hit that subscribe button, share, like, comment. We love to hear all of your thoughts. We have some of the most intelligent people that join us in these chat rooms, and we hope that you will send your comments this way tonight. Before we begin, I am CJ Derringer. I am your host, along with my co-hosts, Dr. Tim Mounts and Smitty Neves. We have a very intelligent person, Dr. Elizabeth Weiss, joining us. She is an anthropologist, a professor from San Jose State University. She's also an author who has recently released a book called On the Warpath. I love this. My battle with Indians, Pretendians, and woke warriors. So I think we've got a lot to dive into on this show. She's also a board member of the National Association of Scholars. So we get to pick her brain about all kinds of fun things, unexplained things, maybe some controversial things. We'll dive into it in just a moment. All Things Unexplained is free to watch on YouTube and listen to wherever you get your podcasts. If you would like to support our show, you can visit our YouTube store. Additionally, you can find us on Venmo under All Things Unexplained. Be sure to check out our website, allthingsunexplained.com. All proceeds from the sales of Dr. Mounts' books on Amazon and Audible also go straight to our show. Dr. Elizabeth Weiss, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Let me ask you a quick question, if you don't mind, about the
Sure.
the science of it. So when these bones are reburied, does that break a link in the science for piecing together these different tribes? Is that the biggest issue with the reburial?
Yeah, so I think the biggest issue is it's a loss of data, and whenever you have a collection, you can restudy it over and over again for new hypotheses. But also, we've seen new types of data. DNA wasn't around in the 1980s, not even really very effective in the 1990s. Isotope analyses to reconstruct diet, but also comparisons. So like when you find a new new remains, especially like if you're looking at Paleo Indians where you only have a dozen of them, every single one needs to be compared to the next one. And if you don't have those remains, you can't do that. Now some people have said, well, why don't you just, scan them and then laser print them out? If that was possible to make a complete identical one in a fast period of time, that would maybe be a kind of a compromise, but it's not possible. But more worrying is that now, as repatriation and reburial has taken a full steam ahead approach, many tribes are against keeping the data and want the data burned. They want the casts smashed. And so even if we gave back all the bones and artifacts, there's no promise that it would end there. And actually, there's good evidence that it wouldn't. So after the Society for American Archaeology conference, then I wrote an op-ed on the changes in California's laws that promised to make even more reburials happen. And that got into a newspaper, and then I posted a tweet. And all good stories have a tweet in them nowadays, right?
Sure
and
seems to.
Yeah. So we were away from the university for months, for I don't know, 17 months or something, a year and a half or so, right? Because of COVID. And so when we finally got back in, I was excited. I was actually really thrilled and happy to be back. And the first thing I did was I went back to the skeletal collection to go into the curation facility to do some of my duties of curating these bones. And I opened up one of the boxes to put another bone in that had just been located for that burial. And I saw this beautiful child's skull that I had seen many times, and I felt, wow, it's so good to be back with this collection. And so I took a photo, I posted it online, and I said, so good, so happy to be back with old friends. And
didn't go well.
This didn't go well. And it's kind of interesting because actually, if you look at how many negative comments my op-ed tweet had, it had many more, but it was the photo that caused my university to decide to take retaliatory actions against me, and they locked me out of the curation facility. They literally changed the law, and they basically said that I was not to have any access to any of the materials inside that room. Some of those materials were not Native American. And so, for example, it took me 10 months to get access to a collection from Carthage, which I should have been able to have access to right away, regardless. Carthage has nothing to do with the Native Americans, right? It's Tunisia, for Christ's sake. So, but it took me 10 months. But this retaliatory action led me to file suit against my university, San Jose State University, fight for my rights to get the Carthage collection, to make sure that they don't take me out of the classroom, which they were threatening to do, and to and continue my career. Unfortunately, it's because Native Americans, you cannot sue them. They are immune from suit. It complicated the success of my case, but I did have many successes, including getting that Carthage collection.
And so all of these different experiences led to this new book, yes?
That's right. So all of these experiences led to the new book, and I decided to call it On the Warpath, My Battles with Indians, Pretendians, and Woke Warriors, because I felt like, in a way, this last 3 years, that's what I was. I was like on this path with all these battles coming at me from, one after another. And it didn't even stop after the case. Most recently in 2023, October or something like that, 2023, I was canceled from the American Anthropological Association for a panel that I was going to present at, The panel altogether was "Let's Talk About Sex, Baby: Why Biological Sex Remains an Important Analytical Variable in Anthropology." So I was going to be the biological anthropologist talking about it. There were cultural anthropologists who were going to talk about it. I think there were 4 of us all together, all of us women. The abstract, the panel got accepted. We were all ready to fly to Toronto to give our presentations. Mine was titled something like "No Bones About It, Skeleton, Sex and Skeletons is Binary, People May Not Be," or something like that, you know.
Yeah.
And basically, they canceled the whole panel because they said that sex is on a spectrum and that our panel would cause harm to the LGBTQIAA plus community and other anthropologists. So once again, it was these neo-tribes showing up saying, we don't want anybody's disagreement. And Heterodox Academy, which is where I spent the last year as a fellow here in New York City, they have a Center for Academic Pluralism. Heterodox Academy rescued that panel and put it on as a Zoom. Not nearly as much fun as it would have been to go to Toronto and meet these other female anthropologists who are willing to fight the good fight that biological sex is binary and then have some drinks afterwards. But still, it was important to do.
So for those that were going to purchase this book, are we going to hear some of these stories? Are we going to learn more about the anthropology behind it? What can we expect from the book?
Yeah, so in the book, I give a little bit of how I got to anthropology and how I got to San Jose State and how this was really a dream job for me. And I was so happy to be there. And, you know, for many years, they were very happy to have me. And one of the interesting things is, you know, I got in quote unquote trouble for the photo. They had many times throughout my years at San Jose asked me to pose with skeletal remains for just these types of reasons
Right.
to
I'm
promote
sure
the field,
looking at
right?
that particular photo, I thought to
Right.
myself, I'm certain that many archaeologists, anthropologists, what have you, have taken similar photos to this. I'm not sure why
Right,
this is so
exactly.
harmful.
I think had I not been in the media for being against repatriation, it probably wouldn't have been even noticed, quite honestly. I also talk about the problems in academia in general, issues like how we've started to coddle our students and not treat them like adults. My perspective is, like, I know some people are like, oh, students aren't adults, they're still kids. My perspective is that they're young adults. And, you know, what I think, and I could be wrong, but this is my perspective, is that you treat them like adults and they will rise to the occasion if given that opportunity. Not always, but enough times that that's what makes it worth it. And so I write about my years living on campus as a faculty in residence and my experiences with students in that kind of environment. I also write about the different controversies in anthropology, you know, of course, the sex binary, spectrum issue, but also the various other cultural relativism issues that seem incongruent. For example, you know, we have these kind of weird things in anthropology like queers for Palestine. How did we get there, right? Feminists who embrace World Hijab Day. So I investigate, you know, question how that comes about.
There's a group for everything.
Yes. I dive into the collection that I curated, history and the likely outcome of this collection, and the laws about the reburial laws, but also some of the tactics that Native American tribes and pretendians, people who pretend to be Native American tribes, take to try to stop legitimate research.
Sounds like you've had an uphill battle.
Yes.
Well, Tim, I know you've got some hot takes for Dr. Elizabeth Weiss. pull some
Yes,
of
I
those
do. And
in.
we're pleased to be joined by anthropologist Dr. Elizabeth Weiss, author of On the Warpath. Thanks so much to Elizabeth for being here with us. And you mentioned a tweet earlier, and I don't know
Yeah.
if anybody noticed earlier in our Elizabeth Weiss promo, we had a little tweet, and I love this tweet because it directly relates to our show and you. I'm gonna put it I'm gonna put it up on the screen. I don't know if anybody caught this tweet. Some things in life are more important than UFOs or Chinese spy balloons. Happy Valentine's Day to Elizabeth Weiss. And let's just say we've talked a few times about UFOs and Chinese spy balloons on this show. So
Yes, actually, that photo was taken the day Nick and I got married.
Oh,
That's
wow.
what I that's what I wore to the courthouse. That's what we wore when we got
Cute.
married. But it's funny because Nick has been very supportive throughout all of my my troubles. He not once did he flinch and say, Elizabeth, maybe you're going to lose your job. Maybe you should tone it down, or never. He's a definitely very supportive. But we actually are very different in many ways. We have the same sense of humor, and we have we are very in sync with a lot of things. But I am a complete skeptic on the aliens and UFO.
He told us. He told us on our show. He said he told us a great story, actually, and I can't remember. It might not have been live when we had this discussion, but he said that he came home one day with a book from Chris Bledsoe, who is a very hot name in the UFO world right now. And you were like, "Oh, come on, like more of that. I don't want to do it." And he put it in the office on top of a stack of other books and left it there. And he said the next morning he came in the room and the book was all the way across the room on the floor. And he thought to himself, I guess I better read that book.
Yes, I know. I'm sure that it was maybe like a big palmetto bug who moved it or something.
Lots of earthquakes in California. Lots of earthquakes.
It was something like that.
You secretly read that Chris Bledsoe book, didn't you?
And dropped it on the floor.
I actually think it was in my office. I think because we had put things in my office because we would go back and forth from Tucson to San Jose. And so we had some of his books in my office. And I remember that. Earthquake, something completely explainable.
She says on all things unexplained.
I'm gonna go with ghost, but I really respect and I can feel your pain on the academic level, Elizabeth. I have presented at academic conferences before, and basically I can't really go back because they don't really do scientific presentations anymore, which is really frustrating. So if I go to a conference on kinesiology, I know I'm not really going to see any kinesiology studies, biomechanics, things with data, that sort of thing. It's all going to be very different stuff. And you talked about coddling our students. My department chair and I actually looked at some data over the last several years. And I know you remember the old standard deviation curve, right? And they used to apply it to college courses, and you'd have a few A's and a good bit of B's and a lot of C's, a good bit of a lot of C's and a good bit of D's and a few F's, right? The standard curve. And it used to apply to college classes. And everybody would be like, man, it's going to be hard to get an A in here. Only a few of us are going to get an A. But after analyzing a lot of data, we honestly came up, and this is ironic because we were looking at health and PE classes, but we called it the dumbbell curve because we had all F's and all A's. There was no longer anywhere in between.
And I see that all the time too. When, for example, when we go through evaluations from other professors, if I sat on a review board, tenure review board, or a lecturer review board, we'd go through their data and we'd get, their class averages. And like my class averages, sat usually around a C because, there'd be like some A's, some B's, some C's, some D's, some F's, I'd be like, how does this happen where like the class average is like 3.88? Nobody's failing. Nobody's even getting a C. I think it's real shame that school has been dummied down so much. Universities have been dummied down so much, and it's kind of interesting. Not too long ago, we got an email from our provost, basically scolding us, saying that he's sick and tired of hearing about professors talking about letting the students have been let in who aren't prepared. It's like, but students have been let in that aren't prepared. And he had something like, intellectual rigor in quotes, like scare quotes, like rigor in scare quotes, to emphasize that it's not really rigor. It's like, yes, there is such a thing as rigor. And you know what? An A that you didn't earn does not feel as good as an A that you earned. And students know this too. So many of the students I had would take me would take all of my classes because I liked my classes. And that's not to say that I was like a very popular professor with all students or that I was a great professor. It's one thing is the topic, of course, as a very popular topic. But the other thing is that I did attract students who were just genuinely interested in learning about these things. And I always had a lot of hands-on stuff and a lot of imagery and so forth. And so I really wanted them to get this kind of grasp of, anthropology of the bones, of the body, its importance. Actually, one of the hardest classes I've ever taken was when I was doing my master's degree, because my master's thesis was, and my PhD actually, was on the bone biomechanics of bone strength. And so one of the hardest classes I took was a biomechanics course when I was doing my master's. And it was also the earliest class I ever taken. It started at 7 a.m., but I was always there on time.
Yeah, well, I tell you, there's going to be repercussions for this too, and it's going to get dangerous, I think, at some point, because from what I've noticed, this permeates all disciplines. And so you have folks in the medical field, in anthropology, in archaeology, in physics, in astrophysics, in the classics, in English and languages and mathematics. And I think at some point we're going to start having some repercussions for this.
Yes, and anthropology might be one of the first fields that has fallen in that sense. The last time I went to an anthropology conference, it was quite interesting that most of the talks started with a description of the person, and Nick was with me, so sometimes we had to hold in our laughter, but because like some people were like, "Hi, I'm so and so. I'm wearing a green top. My hair is brown. I'm a white settler colonialist," and sometimes they do, I'm 5A, and sometimes they get things wrong, like they say they're wearing gray and they're actually wearing, red or so forth, which is really odd to get something like that wrong. But the funniest thing was sometimes that was actually the most interesting thing that they had to say. One speaker, for example, went into her talk about how her research was online mother groups, and she was talking about she was a new mother, I guess, and she was talking about having joined these groups, and so it was like that was her research study, and she was like worried, and in particularly groups that focused on not requiring your little child to accept hugs or kisses from relatives, like body autonomy. And then she went after COVID, when she first went out, and her little child saw a person, a black person, and didn't want to be to get a hug or a black person that she knew, but didn't want to get a handshake or a hug from this black person. And the anthropologist was now worried that she was raising a little racist. And it's like, no, you have just spent a year probably telling your kid that if they don't want a hug or so, then they don't have to get one. And now you're putting this value on it because you think it's racist. The kid probably has no sense. It's just a stranger to the kid and doesn't want to be touched by it. That's fine. But it was kind of funny how that all imploded on her because she had been so worried about child autonomy. And then when the first time she goes out into the public without just her family members and sees somebody she knows of a different color, the kid doesn't want a hug. And then she's like, oh no, what have I done? This is not science. This is Dear Abby, or Dear Anne, right? Anne Landers question.
Dear
It's
Abby,
not
that's
science.
funny. Yeah.
Yeah, and Ann Landers, I remember Ann. Well, we do have a few hot takes for you here, Elizabeth, if you're up for that.
Yeah.
I want to lighten things up here a little at the start because anthropology and archaeology, they play a major role in the media and pop culture. So, Elizabeth, what do you think? And I'm dying to know, usually when I do these sorts of things, CJ has no idea what we're talking about. So let's see. Elizabeth and CJ, we'll do both of you. Better movie, Stargate or Planet of the Apes?
Planet of the Apes. Absolutely.
You want my opinion?
Yeah.
I haven't seen either. Sorry.
I knew it.
Next question.
I have to agree. Planet of the Apes, the Charlton Heston.
Yes, the original Charlton Heston, and I love the ending when she's. So I don't think it's way at the ending, but it's close to the ending when the ape woman calls him ugly. Calls Charlton Heston ugly. Kind of turning the tables on what is attractive and what is not. But
I've never even heard of Stargate.
What?
So that's a big thing.
Nick Pope has seen Stargate, I guarantee you.
Yes.
I've seen Stargate.
You like to watch Stargate, CJ. So essentially it's about, scientists have built this Stargate, and it is just like what it sounds like. It's, we had this show on CERN. So Elizabeth, we did a show where a scientist, a doctor came on with us from Switzerland, and she has heard that there's portals in the bottom of CERN. I think wormholes that lead to other dimensions, and this is what the Stargate was.
Okay.
It goes back. Doesn't it go back to Egyptian times? Is that correct?
It had Egyptian connections, yes. But Planet of the Apes, that was such a classic, Elizabeth. It was filled with so many great moments. Like, you remember Charlton Heston, he hurt his throat and he couldn't talk for the beginning of the movie. And then he finally said something, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, all the apes were in shock. Like, what? This human just spoke?
Yes. And so actually, we aren't that different from the apes anyway, so it's actually quite believable.
Oh, yeah. And it makes you wonder. We may actually retouch on that in a minute. I'm going to kind of stick to that trend here. Better movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark or The Mummy?
Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Oh, it's got to be. I thought The Mummy was a little too silly. I mean, it was good, but The Mummy was kind of silly and maybe not that believable. But Raiders of the Lost Ark, like, I'm all in on that because I grew up religious, the Ark of the Covenant, like I would go out looking tomorrow for the Ark of the Covenant if I could.
And I mean, come on, young George Harrison Ford, young Harrison Ford, it's definitely worth a couple hours.
Which movie was it that they were eating monkey brains in like a cave?
That was Temple of Doom.
Temple of Doom.
That was the second one.
Okay, I haven't seen Raiders of the
chilled
Lost
monkey
Ark
brains.
Oh,
Chilled monkey brains.
Raiders of the Lost Ark is where towards the beginning, he's trying to find something. This kind of wrote the script for all future such movies, and he's avoiding all these booby traps, and he hits the wrong thing, and he grabs the relic, and this giant boulder comes rolling at him, and he's like trying to outrun the boulder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I watched Temple of Doom in college, actually, as a professor was teaching us about like how ethnocentric it was. They would have these people eating monkey brains and stuff. So that's the only reason why I've seen that one. I did see The Mummy a long time ago, but I don't totally remember it.
Well, Raiders of the Lost Ark is probably one of the few movies where the professor is not really a bad professor. There are so many movies that have an evil professor or a bad professor, and so he's not a bad professor either. So that's another good reason.
Well, Elizabeth, you brought this up a little earlier, and I would love to have your hot take on something I've been watching, a show on a documentary, Neanderthal.
I haven't seen the show. I've read a lot about Neanderthals and I've taught a lot about Neanderthals. Neanderthals are such an interesting group because they're almost like us, but they're not quite like us. And so the big debate in some ways is whether they are the same species as us, so Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, so a subspecies of Homo sapiens, or whether they were their own species, Homo neanderthalensis. And I would say that in some ways, depending on what I've read recently or watched recently, sometimes I think one way and sometimes I think the other. I'm on the fence on that one. But some of the most interesting things about Neanderthals, I think, are, that they survived in this incredibly cold environment for generations, for thousands and thousands of years. They might have had the first instrument. There is a bare bone whistle, basically a bare bone with some looks like intentionally made holes that some argue is a whistle, and it's not complete, so it's hard to say, but that's kind of intriguing. They were super robust, and their brain size was actually bigger than ours. But if you look at their brain size to body size, our brain size is bigger comparatively, right? Our body size is smaller, so the brain size is bigger comparatively. So it's really kind of interesting. But also the genetics of Neanderthals, was it just last year or the year before that Pablo Svante got the Nobel Prize in Medicine for Neanderthal DNA research? And we've learned so much from Neanderthal DNA that also applies to human, anatomically modern humans, I should say. For example, there seems to be certain genes that we share that maybe code for mental illnesses and addiction, perhaps even, but also for quirky things like red hair. There's, just fascinating things that we're learning about them. One of the interesting things is, like, even though there is some overlap with Neanderthal DNA and modern human DNA, we don't know if that overlap is due to, interbreeding, or whether it is due to sharing a common ancestor, because we don't have any DNA from, let's say, Homo erectus to compare it, right? So is it because of our common ancestry, or is it because of interbreeding? That's hard to say. And I've seen good points for both arguments. But what a fascinating field Neanderthal studies are, and always something interesting and new coming out of that.
And one of the things I learned about Neanderthal, which I thought was fascinating, and I didn't realize, that we have never found an intact Neanderthal skeleton, which is really interesting given that, we have found intact mammoths, for example. Do you have any hypothesis or educated guess on that, Elizabeth?
It's very hard to find an intact human skeleton in general because basically, we're not as robust as, let's say, a mammoth, right? So some of it is just robusticity. But I also think the other thing is that this does suggest that there wasn't always burial, that we increase our odds of finding complete skeletons when there's intentional burial. And there's been a debate whether Neanderthals buried their dead or not. There is a famous flower cave burial site, but then others have pointed out that the pollen that looks like it's a burial site actually might have been related to just pollen drift in the cave, because they didn't initially test the whole cave. So that's still up in the air. But the other thing is animals, scavengers, if the remains were just in caves and not buried, then you might have scavengers attacking those bones. And we have a whole science of what happens when after death, called taphonomy. And it's basically the science of what happens from death to discovery, and shows like all the things that can go wrong to prevent a perfect preservation. And so I think that, looking at the different animals that were around in Europe and in the Near East might have played a role in the fact that we don't have full, complete Neanderthal skeletons. The other thing is that they seem to have had a lot of injuries, and so that might have played a role. They didn't use throwing weapons yet, so this put them in close contact with big animals when they were hunting. And so this would suggest that, sometimes they'd get trampled and so forth, and then those bones wouldn't preserve either. So just a lot of things like that might be the explanation.
To be continued. All things unexplained.
What's your hot take on Travis Taylor?
I've got an exclusive for you guys if you want it about the Alaska.
We do.
Okay.
Dr. Taylor was revealed to be the chief scientist of the UAP task force with the Pentagon.
So some of that, I think, sir, we'll save for closed session.
All Things Unexplained is free to watch on YouTube and listen to wherever you get your podcasts. If you would like to support our show, you can visit our YouTube store. Additionally, you can find us on Venmo under All Things Unexplained. Be sure to check out our website, allthingsunexplained.com. All proceeds from the sales of Dr. Mounce's books on Amazon and Audible also go straight to our show.